The trucks came through the Bureau of Land Management gate at dawn, hauling 150 wild Mustangs nobody wanted. Animals pulled off overcrowded rangeland because the herds had grown past what the desert could support. Most of them were unadoptable by any normal standard. Too old, too aggressive, too scarred from years of fighting for water and forage on ground that had stopped being enough for them. The agency's own handlers had flagged this particular group for a holding facility, which in practice meant they'd likely spend the rest of their lives penned and fed, going nowhere, doing nothing. Because nobody wanted the trouble of gentling horses that had spent a decade being exactly what wild horses are built to be. Into that discussion walked a man in a wheelchair, 46 years old, who ran a small horse property 40 minutes outside of town, and who submitted a request to take the entire group. Not the sound ones, not the young ones easiest to start. All 150, including the ones the agency's own trainers had called dangerous. The BLM contact who took the call actually asked him to repeat himself, because in 20 years of placement work, she had never once had somebody request the animals other adopters specifically avoided. He told her he wasn't looking for easy horses. He was looking for the ones nobody else could use, because those were exactly the ones his methods were built for. Word got around the horse community fast, the way it always does, and a well-known trainer 2 counties over, a big loud man named Garrett Voss, who ran clinics up and down the state and had strong opinions about everything, said at a feed store counter within earshot of 6 people that a man who couldn't stand up in a round pen had no business taking on 150 half-feral Mustangs, and that the whole herd would either hurt him or outlive whatever he was trying to prove. He meant it as a warning. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If you believe the body that gets underestimated is sometimes exactly the one built to see what everyone else missed, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always want to know how far these stories travel. His name was Dean Ashcroft, and 8 years before that BLM call, he had been one of the top young clinicians on the Western horse circuit, the kind of rider other trainers came to watch work colts. Nobody else could get a handle on. He'd built his reputation on quiet hands and quieter patience, the sort of feel for a nervous animal that couldn't be taught so much as absorbed over a lifetime spent watching horses instead of forcing them. Then a truck ran a stop sign on a 2-lane highway outside Casper, and Dean woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later with a spinal injury that told him, in terms doctors don't soften much, that he would never stand in a round pen the same way again. He spent the better part of 2 years afterward doing very little, the specifics of which he never talked about much, even later, except to say that grief for a body that used to work a certain way took longer to get through than anyone warns you it will. His wife had left before the accident, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this, and what he had left was a small property his grandfather had left him, 40 acres of dry-range country, a barn that needed work, and a used wheelchair-accessible truck his insurance had fought him over for 11 months. What brought him back, eventually, was watching an old ranch hand named Otis Blackwell work a colt from the seat of a mule he could no longer safely mount himself, using nothing but voice, timing, and the kind of subtle body language that didn't require legs at all. Otis was 71, half-blind in one eye from a rope accident decades earlier, and had adapted his own methods so thoroughly to what his body could still do that most people who watched him work never noticed what he couldn't do anymore. Dean showed up at Otis's place uninvited on a Tuesday morning with a question he'd been circling for months. Could you actually gentle a genuinely wild horse without ever getting out of a chair? Otis looked at him for a long moment before answering. Depends what you think gentling is, he said. If you think it's about your legs, no. If you think it's about pressure and release and knowing exactly when to ask for less, then your legs were never really doing the work you thought they were. Sit down. That conversation started something neither of them fully expected. Over the following months, Otis became something between a teacher and a skeptic in residence, refusing to hand Dean easy answers, insisting he rebuild his entire approach from the ground up instead of trying to recreate the exact moves he used to make on foot. He taught Dean to read a horse's weight shift and ear position from a stationary position, to use a long, light training pole modified with a custom grip Dean could operate one-handed, to time a release of pressure to the exact half-second that mattered. Because from a wheelchair, timing had to replace almost everything mobility used to cover for. Most of what people think matters in gentling a horse, Otis told him one afternoon, isn't your body at all. It's whether the horse trusts that you'll stop asking the second it gives you something. Horses don't care how you're built. They care whether you keep your word. Dean's first real attempt at working a genuinely difficult horse from the chair went badly. He pushed a green colt too fast, misjudging distance without the ability to quickly reposition himself, and the animal blew through a fence panel rather than face pressure it didn't understand. Otis didn't sugarcoat it. You asked with your equipment instead of your timing, he said. The chair isn't the problem. Rushing is the problem. It was always going to be the problem, chair or not. Dean rebuilt his methods around patience after that, adapting his round pen with sight lines and gate systems he could operate without leaving his chair, developing a system of long lines and target training that let him shape a horse's movement using precise minimal cues, instead of the physical repositioning most trainers relied on without ever thinking about it. It was slow, unglamorous work at first, relearning a craft he'd once done without conscious thought, this time built entirely around what his body could actually do rather than what it used to. By the time the BLM call came, Dean had spent 6 years quietly rebuilding a small, respected reputation, gentling difficult horses other trainers in the area didn't want to take on, mostly rescues and rank problem horses nobody else would touch. But he'd never worked with anything close to 150 truly wild Mustangs at once, and even Otis, when Dean told him what he was planning, went quiet for a long moment before saying only that it was either the smartest thing Dean had ever tried, or the thing that finally proved Garrett Voss right. The horses arrived over 3 separate hauls in early spring, and the scale of it nearly broke the operation before it started. Dean had built one large adaptive round pen with remote-operated gates he could trigger from his chair, but 150 Mustangs needed acreage, water systems, and handling infrastructure his 40 acres and modest savings hadn't fully accounted for. His first mistake was underestimating how much the sheer number of animals would amplify herd anxiety, horses feeding off each other's fear in ways a single problem horse never had. Within the first week, a stampede spooked by nothing more than a slamming truck door took out 200 feet of perimeter fence, and it took him and 2 hired hands 3 exhausting days to recover and re-secure the herd. Otis, when Dean called him in something close to panic, didn't say he'd warned him, though the scale genuinely had worried him privately. He drove out and helped Dean rethink the entire setup, breaking the herd into smaller manageable groups of 15 to 20 animals across separate paddocks, reducing the anxiety amplification effect and letting Dean work manageable numbers at a time instead of one overwhelming mass. It cost Dean nearly everything he had left in savings to build out the additional paddocks and fencing. It also very likely saved the entire project. His second serious mistake came a month later, when he tried to accelerate gentling on one particularly aggressive stallion, using a method that had worked reliably on younger, less traumatized horses. The stallion, which had spent a decade fighting for dominance on overcrowded range, read the faster approach as a direct challenge rather than an invitation, and charged the round pen fence hard enough to nearly reach Dean before the panel held. Otis's response was blunt. That horse has been surviving on aggression for 10 years. You don't outpatient a decade of survival instinct in a month. You respect it, or it puts you in a hospital worse than the one you already left. Dean slowed everything down after that, sometimes to a pace that felt, even to him, almost absurdly gradual. Weeks spent simply existing calmly near a horse's paddock fence before ever attempting direct interaction, letting the animal's own curiosity do work that pressure never could with horses this defended. He learned to read subtle signs of readiness that had nothing to do with textbook behavior. A shift in ear carriage, a change in how a horse positioned itself relative to the gate, small tells that told him an animal was ready for the next small ask before it was ready to show it more obviously. Word moved through the local horse community the way it always did, most of it unkind at first. Garrett Voss made a point of driving past the property more than once, telling anyone who'd listen that the whole operation was a lawsuit waiting to happen. A few people who boarded horses nearby quietly wondered aloud whether somebody should intervene on Dean's behalf, as though his judgment, not just his body, needed checking. But not everyone dismissed it. An older BLM field officer named Marguerite Cho, who'd placed the herd with him in the first place, started stopping by every few weeks just to observe, standing at a respectful distance, watching the way Dean worked a paddock from his chair with something like professional curiosity, revealing her initial skepticism. She'd handled hundreds of wild horse placements over her career and had never seen anyone approach gentling from a stationary position at this scale. The turning point came during the county's worst wildfire season in over a decade, when a fast-moving grass fire jumped a ridge less than 2 miles from Dean's property, forcing an evacuation order across the whole valley. Most horse owners in the area, working with sound, mobile bodies, still struggled to move their animals fast enough. Dean, drawing on systems he'd built specifically because his own mobility couldn't be relied on in a crisis, had already pre-trained every one of his paddock groups to load calmly onto trailers using the same patient, cue-based methods he'd used to gentle them in the first place. When the evacuation order came, Dean and his 2 hired hands moved all 150 Mustangs to safety in under 6 hours, a scale and speed that stunned even Marguerite, who'd seen far smaller evacuations take entire days. 2 neighboring properties with able-bodied owners lost horses that week, animals too wild or too panicked to load in time. Dean didn't lose a single one. That got attention in a way nothing else could have. By that autumn, word of the Mustang gentling had reached well beyond the county, and Dean began fielding calls from BLM offices in 2 other states, asking whether he'd consider taking on additional problem herds using his methods. But the herd wasn't finished testing him yet. In early winter, one of his most difficult groups, a band of 15 horses that included the stallion who'd once charged his fence, began showing signs of a respiratory illness moving fast enough to worry him. He called Marguerite, and together with a visiting equine veterinarian, they identified a strangles outbreak, a highly contagious bacterial infection that could tear through a densely paddocked herd if not caught and isolated immediately. "This is the part nobody warns you about with a herd this size," the vet told him, snapping his case shut. "It's not really about the training most days. It's about catching trouble early enough that patience still has a chance to matter." Dean isolated the affected group immediately, adapting his paddock gate systems to manage quarantine without needing to physically separate animals himself, and the outbreak, caught early, cost him 3 horses instead of what could easily have been 30. By the following spring, Dean had successfully gentled and rehomed 40 of the original 150 Mustangs to qualified adopters. Using a placement and follow-up system built on the same patient philosophy Otis had taught him from the seat of a mule years before. Word of his methods had spread enough that a regional therapeutic riding program reached out, wanting to study his adaptive training systems for their own work with disabled riders and clients. A university extension program asked to document his gentling protocols as a case study in accessible horsemanship. Garrett Voss drove out to the property that same spring, not to apologize, because men like Garrett don't come to apologize, but because the sheer scale of what Dean had built had started nagging at him from a distance. He sat in his truck a long while, watching Dean work a paddock of horses that had once been the group nobody wanted, using nothing but a modified pole and a stillness that Garrett, for all his decades of experience, had never fully learned. Then he got out, walked over and said, flatly, that the herd looked better than any pen he'd run in 30 years. From Garrett, that was close to a surrender. By the second year, Dean was running a full Mustang gentling operation across his property, working with the BLM directly on difficult placement cases other trainers avoided, and mentoring 2 younger trainers, including one himself paralyzed from a rodeo accident, who'd sought Dean out specifically because nobody else in the region understood what he needed to learn. Otis, well into his 80s by then, still came by most weeks, saying perhaps a tenth of what he was thinking, which was, as always, exactly as much as it needed to be. The Mustangs nobody wanted had, in the end, done more than get gentled. They'd become the proof of a method the whole horse world had quietly assumed couldn't exist, that had been sitting the whole time in the patient. Adapted hands of a man everyone had underestimated for the wrong reasons. Dean still works from that same chair, in that same modified round pen, with new problem horses arriving every season that other trainers still don't want to take on. Nobody in that valley calls it a lawsuit waiting to happen anymore. They just watch the gate now, the same way they always did, except now they're waiting to see which horse he'll take on next. If you've ever been underestimated for the wrong reason and proven it wrong anyway, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about people the world gave up on too soon.